The sun was bleeding out behind the rooftops when the sound of high-performance tires crackled over the gravel lot outside Reynolds Auto Service. Mike Reynolds didn't look up at first. He was elbow deep in a rusted-out sedan belonging to a local teacher, trying to make sure her brakes wouldn't give out again on the freeway. But then he heard a low, elegant hum that didn't belong anywhere near this neighborhood, the kind of purr that only came from six figures in European engineering. He wiped his hands on a shop rag as the door swung open. She stepped inside like she didn't belong, and knew it. Tall, crisp, deliberate. The air around her carried the soft scent of expensive perfume, layered over a kind of electric tension, like a thunderstorm waiting to drop. Designer heels tapped across oil-stained concrete, and her sunglasses stayed on, even in the dimming light. She didn't glance around. She didn't ask for help. Her eyes, hidden though they were fixed on him. "You the owner." Her voice was low and steady, confident but not arrogant. Mike studied her for half a beat. Most folks who wandered in here came in one of two moods: desperate or pissed. She was neither. "Yeah," he replied slowly, peeling off his gloves. "Mike Reynolds, what can I do for you?" "I need a full tune-up," she said, glancing briefly over her shoulder toward the gleaming red machine outside. It looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor, sleek, customized, and unmistakably out of place next to the busted minivans and sun-faded trucks Mike usually worked on. "Porsche 911 Turbo S, batteries surging, weird handlings tight on left turns. I want you to take a look at it personally." He blinked, already suspicious. "You sure you've got the right place? There's a specialty shop out in Oakwood that deals with exotics, certified and everything." "I know where I am," she said. "I didn't ask for Oakwood. I asked for you." That gave him pause. Mike hadn't done anything with high-end imports in years. He'd turned down more custom engine work than he could count since leaving that life behind. Most days he was lucky if he got paid in full, but the way she said it, like his name was the destination, not the detour, unsettled something inside him. "You ever been here before?" he asked. "Not exactly." She paused, finally removing her sunglasses. Her eyes were sharp, familiar in a way he couldn't place. "But I've been looking for you for a long time." Mike's breath caught just for a second. Something about her face stirred a faint ache in his chest, but he brushed it off. "Well, you found me. Pop the hood." She turned without another word, those heels clicking back into the twilight. Mike followed slowly, heart thumping louder than he liked. That car her didn't belong here, and neither, if he was honest, did the past she might be dragging behind her. The hood clicked open with the smooth mechanical sigh of luxury engineering. Even before Mike touched a wrench, he could feel it. This wasn't just a sports car. It was a message. Every polished inch gleamed like a memory he didn't want to remember. He leaned in, flashlight in one hand, inspecting the power unit with slow, deliberate care. Anything to stay focused, anything to stay out of his head. She didn't speak for a while, just watched him work, arms folded over a tailored blazer, her eyes unreadable in the dusk. He could feel her gaze the way some men felt a loaded gun. Heavy, waiting, deliberate. "You still go by Mike now?" she asked finally, voice soft but direct. He paused, one hand hovering near the engine's coolant valve. "That's the name on the sign." A smile played on her lips, not warm, not mocking, just knowing. "Funny, you used to hate it when people called you that." Mike's fingers stiffened on the socket wrench. "The only people who ever knew that weren't around anymore. You always told us it's speed, just speed. Like it meant something. Like you had to remind yourself." His chest tightened. He stepped back from the car, setting the wrench down a little too hard on the cart beside him. The clatter echoed through the garage. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, voice low. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. "I'm someone who remembers who you were before everything burned down." And there it was. That word burned. It hit him like a steel pipe to the ribs. The fire, the track, the screaming, the metal twisted around his best friend's body. The roar of engines that had once made him feel invincible, now ringing like sirens in his nightmares. "Speed King," she said, almost reverently, like naming a ghost. "Fastest thing on four wheels in the Tri-County circuit, until you disappeared." She snapped her fingers. Poof, like smoke. Mike's breath turned shallow, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "That name died a long time ago," he said. "No," she replied, stepping closer. "He didn't die. He went underground, hid, but not very well." The garage was quiet except for the ticking of the cooling engine and the slow spin of an overhead fan. Mike's throat felt tight, his skin prickling with memories he'd buried in oil stains and overdue bills. "How do you know that name?" he whispered. She pulled something from her bag and held it out. A photograph. Old, faded, worn at the edges. A teenage boy leaning against a race car, grinning like the world was his and time couldn't touch him. And beside him, unmistakably, was her, younger, less guarded, but her. "I was there that night," she said. "I watched the fire from the stands. Everyone said you died. I didn't believe it. Not for a second." Mike stared at the photo, at himself. Speed King, the boy who had a future, and then at her. And for the first time in 17 years, the past came rushing back like gasoline to a spark. Mike rolled his sleeves back down to his elbows, partly for the cold and partly to cover the rising unease crawling along his forearms. The Porsche purred beside him, hood raised like a stage curtain. But what lay underneath wasn't stock, not even close, at first glance. It was every bit the perfection you'd expect from a handcrafted supercar. Symmetrical lines, sleek integration of electric hybrid systems, a gleaming power core, but deeper, in the bones of it. Things weren't where they should be. The battery pack had been rerouted. The air intake was tuned with a restrictor mod that wasn't standard for any commercial version. The torque control system had been recalibrated with old-school finesse, less computer code. More gut instinct. He bent closer and ran his fingers along the mount holding the custom manifold in place. Someone had shaved it down by hand to adjust airflow just slightly, just enough to matter. His breath caught. He remembered doing that exact same thing 17 years ago. Same cut, same micro weld. The scars from the tool marks matched the shape of the wrench he'd favored back when he was still Speed King. "Where'd you get this car?" he asked without looking up. Behind him. The woman's heels clicked softly against the concrete as she approached. "Technically, I built it," she said. "But most of the performance tuning was already there when I found the prototype. I just restored it." Mike stared into the guts of the machine as if it might answer for her. "This isn't restored. It's resurrected." "Is there a difference?" "Yeah," he said, stepping back. "One honors the original. The other brings back something that wasn't supposed to return." She didn't respond, but her silence was louder than any answer. Mike popped the fuse panel open. The wiring was tight, almost military in its precision, and near the edge, barely visible beneath layers of circuitry, was a scratch, tiny, intentional. 4 characters etched into the casing SK-97. His knees nearly gave out. He'd only ever inscribed those letters into one engine, the prototype he'd built with his bare hands, the one he swore could rival anything on the pro circuit, if it hadn't been torched in the fire. "You found this." His voice was barely above a whisper, disbelieving. "You found that car." "I found you first," she corrected. "The car just confirmed it." Mike stepped back from the engine, heart hammering against his ribs. His mind was tumbling backward through time, through flame and smoke and betrayal. That car was supposed to be gone. That engine never made it out of the wreckage. "You rebuilt it," he said, still not quite believing. "I restored it," she said gently, stepping beside him. "Because someone once told me that machines can carry memory, that if you build them with love, they don't just move, they remember." Mike stared into the open hood, into the ghost of the man he used to be. The engine didn't just remember, it had come back looking for him. Mike leaned against the workbench, palms bracing his weight as if the truth might knock him off balance. The name etched into the engine still burned behind his eyes. SK-97. It wasn't just a car. It was a chapter torn from a book he thought had gone up in smoke. And now, standing a few feet from him, was the woman who dragged that chapter back into the light. She watched him quietly, as if measuring the moment, deciding how much to give him before it cracked the surface of everything he thought he knew. "I suppose I should tell you my name," she said, slipping her sunglasses into her purse with a kind of ceremony. "Eleanor Brooks." It hit like a low, blunt strike to the chest. The name echoed inside him, not loud, but long, faint, familiar. Like a song he hadn't heard since he was 17. His brow furrowed, scanning the name for purchase. "Brooks," he repeated softly. "Your old man. He was a sponsor. Track money. William, wasn't it?" Eleanor nodded once. "Very good." Mike straightened slowly, suddenly aware of how much taller she stood now, how far she'd traveled from the wide-eyed teenager that name tugged at in his memory. "Your dad ran the big rigs," he murmured. "Custom engines. Sponsored half the racers on the South Circuit." "He did," she said. "But that's not how you knew me." Mike squinted, trying to drag the picture forward, but all he could find were fragments. Laughter echoing off steel bleachers, the sharp scent of gasoline, a girl's voice calling to him during a pit stop, always at the edges, never in the center. She stepped closer, and her eyes didn't blink. "You don't remember me, do you?" There was something about the way she said it, like it wasn't a question at all, like it was a blade dipped in regret. Mike's pulse stuttered. He searched her face again, harder this time. High cheekbones, a small scar near her left brow, barely visible under flawless makeup. His memory finally caught the edges of her softer then, younger, with grease on her fingers from helping change tires when no one was watching. She used to sneak into the garage before races and sit on his toolbox, peppering him with questions about gear ratios and fuel injection, like some kid obsessed with legends. He swallowed hard. "You're Ellie. Little Ellie Brooks." She nodded, a ghost of a smile curling at her lips. "You were the only one who ever called me that." Mike stumbled back a step, as if her words physically struck him. "You were just a kid. So were you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with years they hadn't shared. Paths diverged by fire and fate. Mike didn't know what scared him more, the girl who'd become this woman, or the version of himself she clearly hadn't forgotten. And now she was standing in his garage, calling him speed again, dragging the past into the light like it had unfinished business. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his voice betrayed him. Eleanor Brooks didn't flinch. She just looked at him like she'd been waiting for this moment half her life. "Neither should you," she said, "but here we are." The roar of engines was like thunder bottled and released in waves, echoing through the industrial lot beneath a flickering orange sky. It smelled like oil, burnt rubber, and heat pure adrenaline in the air. People lined the makeshift track, leaning over concrete barricades, their faces lit by the fire of headlamps and the promise of speed. This was the underground circuit at its peak. No rules, no sponsors, no cameras, just machines, metal, and guts. And in the middle of it all stood Speed King. At 19, Mike Reynolds was a ghost on the streets, too fast to catch, too smart to crash, and too wild to tame. His black '98 RX-7 was already legend, rebuilt from scraps and nightmares, outfitted with a prototype engine he designed in a garage with no name on the door. He drove like he was chasing something he could never reach. Maybe he was, back then. No one could touch him, not in a straightaway, not on the curves. And certainly not when he turned his cap backward and tightened the gloves his father left him before vanishing from his life. That night was supposed to be his send-off, one last underground race before he went clean. He had papers in his duffel bag from a pro league team in Atlanta. They were offering real money, real sponsorship, real rules. No more midnight races, no more risking his life for applause and bragging rights. Just fame, fuel, and a clean track. Eleanor Ellie back then was barely 15. She sat cross-legged on the hood of her father's old pickup truck, watching from the edge of the chaos. She was supposed to be in bed, but she never missed Speed's races. She'd sneak out, scribble notes about throttle modulation and turbo lag in her journal, and dream of the day someone would take her seriously in a world ruled by speed and testosterone. Speed was the only one who didn't pat her on the head or call her a mascot. He talked to her like she had a brain, like she belonged there. The lineup that night was stacked. Local legends and out-of-towners hoping to knock the crown off Speed's head before he vanished into the big leagues. Victor Harmon was among them, driving a silver Supra that looked fast and felt colder than ice. Harmon didn't care about speed. He cared about power, respect, and Speed had always had both. The race started at midnight sharp. Tires screamed, flames belched from tailpipes. The crowd erupted like a coliseum of the damned. Speed was ahead by a half-second at the halfway point. Clean shifts, perfect lines, then sudden heat, a scream from the left side of his car. Something wasn't right. The engine roared unevenly. Flames licked the seams near the manifold. Then came the explosion. The crowd scattered in chaos. Metal twisted. Sparks danced through the night air like furious fireflies. Speed's car flipped once, then again, before slamming against a barrier and bursting into flame. And just like that, Speed King was gone. No body was ever recovered. Just ash, just wreckage, just silence. But in the shadows, someone watched, someone remembered, and 17 years later, someone brought him back. The fluorescent lights above the garage buzzed faintly as the evening settled into a thick, aching quiet. Mike stood with his arms folded, leaning against the workbench. But he wasn't seeing the tools or the Porsche anymore. He was staring past them, into smoke, into flame, into memory. Eleanor stood a few feet away, hands clasped in front of her, eyes steady. There was no more dancing around the past now. She'd peeled it open, layer by layer, until only truth remained. "I thought you were dead," she said softly. "Everyone did. That fire, it wasn't survivable." Mike's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "I watched your car disappear into flames," Eleanor continued. "Victor told everyone you were gone, that the fireball meant nothing could have made it out. Your crew gave statements. There was even a memorial race the next month. And still, I never believed it. Not for a second." Mike turned away, gaze fixed on the oil-stained floor like it could somehow absorb the shame rising in his chest. "I searched for you," she said. "I looked for you online, through old racing forums, even sent letters to people who might have known you. It was like you had evaporated. No obituary, no police record, no hospital stay, just gone." He let the silence sit for a moment longer before finally speaking. His voice was low, like gravel being dragged across steel. "I did disappear." "Why?" she asked, stepping forward. "Why would you let the world believe you were dead?" Mike exhaled slowly, then looked up, and something in his face had changed. The armor dropped. The man in front of her was older now, more worn, but also more raw. "Because I wanted to be," he said. "Because that kid Speed King died in that fire." "Or should have." She blinked, caught off guard not by the words, but by the certainty behind them. "I crawled out through the passenger side," Mike said, voice flat. "The blast knocked me into the barrier and tore half the door off. I don't even remember doing it. I woke up in a drainage ditch behind the pit wall, flames behind me and sirens coming fast. Why didn't you call for help?" "I did, but nobody heard, and by the time I made it back to the edge of the track, they had already pulled out what was left of the car. The crowd was gone. Victor was giving interviews, saying I must have been incinerated, that it was over." He gave a bitter laugh. "And I believed him." He looked down at his hands, scarred, strong, but not the hands of a racer anymore. "I knew what that fire meant," he continued. "Victor always wanted my engine, my design. He didn't care about winning, just about owning what I built. The explosion wasn't an accident. Eleanor's eyes widened. You think he sabotaged you? I know he did, Mike said. And I knew no one would believe me. Not without proof. And by the time I found breath enough to speak, the world had already buried me. So you let it, she whispered. I let it, he confirmed. Then quietly, Eleanor stepped beside him. Well, I didn't. And for the first time in 17 years, Mike realized just how long someone had been reaching into the dark, hoping he'd reach back. The hum of the engine still lingered faintly in the air, like the ghost of something once alive. But Mike no longer saw the Porsche. He saw a hallway of fire, a wreckage he was never supposed to crawl out of, and a life that had split in two the man he had become, and the one he was supposed to be. Eleanor stood beside him, steady, composed, but her fingers trembled slightly as she reached into her purse. I need you to see something, she said, her voice not quite steady now. Mike watched as she pulled out a folded photo, creased in the middle, the edges worn soft by time and handling. She hesitated before handing it over, and in that pause was something heavier than words. Fear, maybe, or hope, or both. He took the photo slowly, wary of the weight it might carry. It was a boy, maybe 15, maybe 16, standing beside a racetrack somewhere out west. The hills in the background were sun-bleached, the sky a hard, cloudless blue. The boy was mid-laugh, one foot on the barrier rail, a pair of gloves tucked into his back pocket. He wasn't posing. Someone had caught him in a moment of unguarded joy. But Mike's breath hitched before he even registered the details. It was the eyes. Those weren't eyes you could mistake. Clear and wide, a shade of green that looked lit from within, framed by thick lashes and an intensity that didn't know how to dim. Eyes Mike had seen in the mirror for most of his life. Eyes Sarah, his mother, used to call storm watchers eyes because they always looked like they were waiting for something to change. He stared at the photo for a long moment, unable to speak. His name is Jason, Eleanor said softly. He just turned 16. Mike looked up slowly. 16. She nodded. The math hit like a sledgehammer. 17 years since the fire. 16 years since this boy had been born. Eleanor hadn't needed to spell it out. She'd given him everything but the thunderclap. I wasn't sure for a long time, she went on. I didn't even know I was pregnant until weeks after the explosion. And then you were gone. Dead. As far as the world knew, my father, he handled everything. I wasn't allowed to speak about you. Not to Jason, not to anyone. Mike blinked hard, trying to push back the swell rising in his chest. Why now? He asked, barely managing the words. Why come find me after all these years? Because he's starting to ask questions, she said. And because last month, he rebuilt the carburetor in my old Civic without instructions. Told me it felt better when it breathed a little deeper. Mike stared at her. He builds engines in his head, she whispered. Just like you did. He looked back at the photo, hands trembling now. The boy's grin, the posture, the restless energy barely contained in a still frame. He didn't need a test. He didn't need a timeline. He knew. That's my son, Mike said quietly. Eleanor nodded, tears in her eyes. I think so, too. The photograph lay on the workbench beside him, the boy's eyes still staring up, frozen in time. But Mike's own gaze had drifted far beyond the edges of that print. His knuckles whitened against the edge of the table, breath shallow. He wasn't in the garage anymore. He was back at Silvercrest Raceway, 17 years ago, back in the heat of that night, the air thick with oil fumes, sweat, and something unspoken in the pit of his chest. That was supposed to be his last race before everything changed. One more glory lap before he traded underground infamy for a legitimate career. The call had come through just hours before. Atlanta wanted him, a pro circuit team. They saw the raw edge of brilliance in his driving, and they wanted to polish it. He almost didn't race that night. Almost. But pride has sharp teeth, and Victor Harmon had shown up with his new rig and a smirk that said he wasn't just there to win, He was there to humiliate Speed King in front of the city that made him. Mike remembered the rumble in his gut when he saw Victor lean into his own pit crew, gesturing toward Speed's car, remembered the faint tremble in the gas pedal during warm-up. Something was off. He felt it, ignored it. He climbed in anyway. The race was chaos, tight curves and loose egos. And then halfway through the third lap, it happened. A snap, a jolt, then fire. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a hiss, the scream of a failing fuel line. And then a bloom of orange erupted from under the hood, wrapping around the windshield like the hand of death. He barely had time to yank the wheel before the world turned into spinning glass and metal and flame. The car rolled once, then twice, the passenger side slamming into a barricade before landing on its roof. Upside down, crushed, cracked ribs, smoke choking his throat, and then the screaming, not his, hers. He never saw her face, just a figure. Small, running toward the wreckage. Someone had jumped the fence. A girl. Maybe? Her voice pierced through the fire, calling his name over and over again. Speed! And then the second explosion. It tore through the night like a warhead. Mike remembered the heat more than the sound, how it seemed to reach into his chest and rip the breath from him. He remembered being dragged by his own arms. He thought, through the shattered door, across gravel and dirt, far from the flames. Then everything went black. They never found a body. Authorities said the remains were too damaged to identify. His crew, numb and scattered, couldn't explain how he vanished. They assumed he'd burned up in the wreck. There was a funeral, an empty casket, and a death certificate that lied. But the worst of it was the scream. The girl who ran toward him, the one he didn't save. He never knew her name, never found out if she lived, and every night since, her voice haunted him like a promise broken in flame. The next morning, the air in the garage was thick with the scent of gasoline and the heaviness of old truths unearthed. Mike hadn't slept. The photo of Jason remained on his workbench, weighted down by a socket wrench like it might float away if he didn't pin it to something solid. But no tool in the world could anchor what was spinning inside him now. Eleanor returned just after sunrise, a manila folder clutched under her arm and something sharper in her gaze than the night before. You were right, she said before he could even ask. About what? She placed the folder on the bench and opened it without flourish. Inside were photographs, blueprints, old schematics, and a series of crisp, professional images taken in what looked like a sleek, glass-walled lab. Each one showed the same thing from different angles. A hybrid combustion electric engine, streamlined in design, efficient in form. Mike stared at it like he was seeing a ghost. Because he was. He reached out slowly, tracing a familiar line in the design, the left intake curve, the dual-path cooling channels, the asymmetric torque delivery system he had once called his secret weapon. This wasn't someone else's engine. It was his, the prototype, the one he had been perfecting in his garage back in '05, the one he'd built by hand, alone in the silence between races, dreaming of something that could outpace the future. This was never released, he said, voice barely a whisper. No, Eleanor said, but it was built. I found it buried in a storage vault under my father's estate, sealed in a crate labeled Brooks Archive, Do Not Open. No records in the company system, no patent, no history. Mike's stomach churned. I ran the specs through the patent database, she continued. Guess what I found? He didn't have to guess. Someone filed an intellectual property claim 5 years ago, a derivative adaptation. They called it minor tweaks, new housing. But the core is yours. Speed, your design, your wiring, your signature. He felt the air thinning in the room. It was like drowning again, only this time slower, more surgical, not in fire, but in betrayal. Victor, he muttered. Eleanor nodded. He's the one who pushed for the Brooks acquisition 3 years ago. Bought out the patents. But he never declared the engine in the deal, because if he had, someone might have recognized it for what it really was. A theft. Mike's fist clenched on the bench, knuckles pale. He let me burn, stole my life, then built his empire off the ashes. Eleanor slid another document toward him, a timeline, a financial report, licensing agreements, all traced back to Harman Innovations. Your design powers over 20% of their current engine fleet, she said. He's made millions, quietly, legally, almost. Mike looked down at the photo of Jason again, then back to the engine. Unfinished business. Indeed, if Victor Harman thought the fire ended everything, he was wrong. Speed King didn't die that night. He'd just been waiting to rise. The morning light slanted through the garage windows in long, golden blades, slicing across the Porsche's hood like judgment. Mike stood in silence, hood raised, fingers slowly trailing the contours of the hybrid engine nestled inside. The calm in his face was deceptive. Beneath the surface, something was unraveling thread by thread. He had taken the engine apart before dawn. Unable to resist the pull, there was something in it, something whispering to him like a familiar voice. Muffled by time, Eleanor had said it matched the prototype he'd built, that Harman had used it as a foundation. But until now, he hadn't felt it. Now he did. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. Every weld, every curve, every anomaly in the casing deliberate and familiar. He reached for a small flashlight, angled it beneath the intake housing, then narrowed his eyes. There, hidden along the inside lip of the throttle body, beneath where no mechanic would normally think to look, two small letters nearly worn smooth by time, in heat SK. He stepped back like he'd been struck. The world didn't tilt, but it narrowed down to that one mark, that one carving, barely there but undeniable. Speed King, the name he hadn't spoken in years, the one he left behind in a burning shell on the edge of Silvercrest Ridge. He'd etched it there one night, half drunk on Red Bull and dreams, carving his identity into the only thing he ever fully trusted, his machine. Mike didn't speak for a while. He just stared at it. Eleanor stood across from him, arms folded, watching. She didn't interrupt. Didn't need to. She saw it when he found the initials. Saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hands dropped from the edge of the car like they didn't belong there anymore. He finally looked up. I built this, he said, the words bitter in his mouth. Every inch of it. This was mine. Eleanor nodded slowly. I know. I remember shaping the housing on my cousin's back porch with a grinder that kicked every 10 seconds. I remember using a kitchen scale to measure flow balance because I couldn't afford real lab equipment. He turned back to the engine like he might still find more of himself buried in it. I remember bleeding into the manifold when I cracked my hand open on the turbine bracket. Right there, he pointed. Left side. I bled into the sealant. A pause. That's my blood on this blueprint. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. And now it's being sold by the man who let the world believe you were dead. Mike exhaled slowly, but it sounded more like a growl than a breath. This car, it's proof. This engine is the missing chapter. It's the beginning, Eleanor said. Mike shook his head. No, it's the reckoning. He closed the hood gently, reverently, like he was sealing a coffin. But the look in his eyes wasn't grief. It was resurrection. Oninum. The garage door was still half open, letting in a breeze that smelled like dust and sunlight on hot pavement. The Porsche sat there in silence, its hood closed, but the truth inside it still humming. Mike paced slowly across the floor, hands on his hips, shoulders tense like a man walking a tightrope between past and future. Eleanor leaned against the workbench, watching him with eyes that had grown sharper since yesterday. She had shown him the engine, the initials, the stolen blueprint. She had cracked the coffin open and dared him to look at the body inside. Now came the part that felt less like memory and more like consequence. You're not just here to show me what Harman did, Mike finally said, turning to face her. You're here to use me. Eleanor didn't flinch. I'm here to work with you. Same thing. No, she said quietly. Not this time. Mike let the silence settle again. He looked at the photo of Jason, still pinned under a wrench on the bench. That face, that look, that laugh caught in midair. So much of him in that one still frame, it made the air feel heavier. Eleanor stepped forward, pulling a folded document from her bag. It wasn't formal, no seals, no logos, just typed pages and notes in her tight, slanted handwriting. She laid it gently beside the photo. I've spent years trying to piece it all together, she said. Old Brooks invoices, private storage records, off-the-books purchases. My father kept secrets. So did Victor. But I know this engine didn't just appear out of thin air. Mike scanned the first page. Dates, serial numbers, diagrams. His diagrams. Though someone had cleaned them up. Sanitized the edges? You want my help proving Harmon stole it? He asked. Yes, but not just for the court of law, she said. For the court of truth. The truth that says you didn't die in that wreck. That you were a genius before the world forgot your name. That the empire he built is sitting on a foundation he never poured. Mike looked at her, his eyes narrowing. And what do you want out of it? Eleanor hesitated, then answered with the kind of honesty that didn't flinch. Closure and justice. For you, for me, for Jason. The name cracked something in him again. If you help me prove this, she continued, I'll back you. Whatever it takes. Legal team, forensics, witnesses. I'll put my family name and my money behind you. And when this is over, win or lose, I'll help you get back what you lost. He raised an eyebrow. Engineering. She shook her head. Everything. The work, the credit, the life. A pause. And the boy. Eleanor's expression softened. I'll help you meet him. I won't stand in the way. Mike stared at her for a long time, the weight of 17 years pressing down like a storm cloud behind his ribs. He thought of the fire, the silence, the second life spent in a borrowed name. Why now, he asked. Because he's old enough to ask questions. She said, and you're old enough to stop running. Mike looked at the engine one more time, then at the photo. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of heat and silence, winding through rolling hills and past tidy suburbs that had no memory of fire or wreckage. Mike drove without speaking, knuckles tight on the wheel. Eleanor sat beside him, glancing at her phone once, then putting it away like even the time of day had become irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was who they were going to see. The private school appeared like a postcard, red brick buildings with white trim, neatly manicured lawns and a curved driveway that sparkled under the sun. It felt like another planet compared to the cracked asphalt and cinder block walls of Mike's world. It was a place that belonged to kids with clean sneakers and futures laid out in monogram folders. Eleanor pointed to the track behind the gymnasium. He's got afternoon drills with the robotics club. They meet outside when the weather's good. Mike pulled over near the edge of a maintenance lot and cut the engine. His heart wasn't just beating, it was hammering, fast and uneven, like a drag car at the starting line, revving too high and too soon. He spotted Jason almost instantly, tall for his age, lean and wiry, like a coiled spring. His gait was quick, purposeful. A green hoodie hung loose over a black t-shirt that looked oil-stained at the hem. He had a socket wrench in one hand and a half-assembled RC car under his arm. He wasn't running, but everything about him looked like he was built to. Mike leaned forward, squinting, the way the kid moved, head low, focused, with a chip on the shoulder rhythm. It punched him in the chest. He recognized it too well. The impatience with anything that couldn't keep up. The hunger to build something better, faster, stronger. It wasn't just blood. It was instinct. A group of students circled around Jason as he knelt by a portable table, adjusting the wiring with a quiet confidence that felt too familiar. Another boy cracked a joke. Jason laughed, but didn't look up. He was too deep into the circuitry, Lost in a machine only he could hear, Mike blinked, and for a moment, it wasn't the boy anymore. It was him. 17 years ago, tuning a carburetor by feel, reading airflow by sound, blocking out the world until the engine purred just right. He's got your eyes, Eleanor said quietly, and your posture. God help me. Mike didn't answer. Couldn't. His throat was tight and dry like he'd swallowed dust, but he couldn't stop watching. Jason set the RC car down, flipped a switch, and sent it flying down the practice lane. Sharp, clean turns, perfect speed modulation. The kids cheered. Jason just smirked, shoulders still, as if he already knew it would work. Mike swallowed hard. That's my son, he whispered. Eleanor nodded. He doesn't know it yet. Mike pressed his hands into his knees, grounding himself, but everything inside him felt like it was already lifting off. The afternoon sun had softened by the time Mike made his way around the side of the gym, where the school's old maintenance shed stood half forgotten behind a line of hedges. The shop instructor had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to let Mr. Reynolds take a look at the school's aging fleet of training vehicles. A transmission was sticking in one of the hybrids. It was the perfect excuse. Neat, professional, distant. But Mike's hands weren't steady. Inside the open-air workshop, the smell of coolant and battery acid mingled with fresh-cut grass. A student leaned over the open hood of a white hatchback, half his body buried in the engine bay. He was muttering to himself, tools clinking against metal in short, practiced rhythms. Need a hand, Mike said, voice calm but tight. The boy startled slightly, then looked up, and there he was, Jason Brooks, face streaked with sweat and concentration, eyes sharp as glass. He glanced at Mike, then back to the engine, already refocusing. You the mechanic Mr. Brooks called? Mike nodded. Yeah, Mike. You must be part of the advanced group, Mike said, looking at the complexity of what the boy was attempting. Only one who shows up after 4, Jason muttered, then added, I like working when it's quiet. Mike approached carefully, not to crowd him. He scanned the engine layout. Simple, but someone had rewired part of the controller box. Not sloppily, not at all. Did you do this? He asked, pointing to the rerouted grounding wire. Jason wiped his hands on a rag, shrugged. The default circuit was inefficient. I shaved off about 3% heat loss. Mike couldn't hide the grin that tugged at the edge of his mouth. That's not just impressive, that's precise. I like figuring stuff out, Jason said, more to the engine than to him. Mike crouched beside him, taking care to let silence stretch comfortably. Then, carefully, you get it from your mom? Jason paused, glancing at him sideways. Mom runs numbers. She works with tech investments. Doesn't get her hands dirty. What about your dad? That made the boy stiffen. I don't know, Jason said after a pause. She never talks about him. Ever. Mike kept his eyes on the wiring. That ever bother you? Jason didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was different, low and even, like he'd rehearsed it before. It used to, but I figured if she won't say anything, maybe there's nothing worth knowing. Mike swallowed. That doesn't mean it's true. Maybe, the boy wiped his brow. But people don't just disappear unless they want to. Mike felt that one land. Sharp, honest, fair. They worked quietly for a while, passing tools, adjusting settings. The hybrid purred to life on the first try. Jason grinned. Mike just watched him. The ghost had a name, a heartbeat, a future, and he was standing right next to it, finally close enough to touch, but not ready to be known. The rain tapped against the garage roof like impatient fingers as Eleanor slid a stack of documents across the workbench. Outside, the sky had turned a dull, bruised gray, and thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. Mike stood with arms folded, jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the top page but not reading it. Not yet. This is it, Eleanor said. The trail. Every contract, every licensing deal, every lie. neatly documented in legal ink. Mike finally lowered his gaze. The first page bore the letterhead of Harmon Innovations, a sleek logo with clean lines and colder intentions. Beneath it, terms of acquisition. 5 years ago, Victor Harmon had purchased the remnants of Brooks' underground development lab. Among the items listed unclaimed prototype hybrid engine, designer pending formal attribution. Attribution? Mike scoffed under his breath, as if someone just found that engine lying around without asking who built it. Eleanor tapped a highlight. Here, this is where it gets personal. The design was listed under a dummy account SK Technologies. You ever use that name, she asked. Mike stared hard. Yeah, briefly. Back when I was working on side projects. Before the fire. She flipped to the next page. It was a scan of a signature authorization, scrolled and barely legible. But Mike's stomach turned when he saw it. That's not mine, he said. That's Victor. He faked my sign-off. Eleanor nodded. We pulled the metadata on the file. It was uploaded 6 months after your crash. 6 months after the world thought Speed King had died. Mike's hand curled into a fist on the bench. He didn't just steal the engine. He stole my identity to make it legitimate. Eleanor reached for her tablet, swiping through to a photo. A high-end race vehicle branded with Harmon Innovations, its engine specs neatly detailed on the side. Mike's heart dropped when he read the performance numbers. An exact match to the prototype he had once sworn would change the game. That's your engine, she said, wrapped in chrome and sold under his name. The photo changed. Victor standing in front of a row of gleaming vehicles, shaking hands with a CEO from the Pacific Electric Circuit. The caption called him a pioneer of hybrid racing technology. Mike turned away, the air in the garage suddenly too thin. He was my friend, he muttered. We used to dream together, build together. He watched me bleed into that engine. And then, when the fire gave him a clean slate, he used it to bury me. Eleanor's voice was calm but edged. He built an empire on your grave. Mike didn't speak. He didn't have to. Because in that silence, something older than anger was rising. Something colder, deeper. Not revenge. Not yet. But a reckoning. And this time, the paper trail didn't just lead to Victor Harmon. It led home. The glass tower loomed above the downtown skyline like a monument to someone else's legacy. Sleek, silver, and unapologetically modern. Harmon Innovations stood as the kind of place where power dressed in tailored suits and walked on polished marble without looking down. Mike hadn't set foot in this part of the city in over a decade. But today, he walked through the revolving doors like a man carrying thunder in his chest. The receptionist glanced up, startled by the grease-stained jacket, the scuffed boots, the steady eyes. Do you have an appointment? Sir, Mike didn't answer. He just walked past. Sir, excuse me, you can't. But the guard at the elevator had barely stood before Mike flashed a visitor badge Eleanor had pulled strings for, and the elevator doors opened like they were waiting for him. 34 floors up, the air got thinner, quieter. Mike stepped out into a hallway that gleamed like a showroom, filled with abstract art and glass panels etched with words like innovation, speed, precision, words that used to mean something. He reached the end of the corridor and opened the door without knocking. Victor Harmon sat behind a sprawling glass desk, flipping through a leather-bound portfolio. His salt and pepper hair was styled like everything else about him. Calculated, confident. He didn't look up immediately, assuming perhaps it was another executive assistant or venture partner. Put it on the table, and he said, I'll review it after the call. Mike didn't move. Victor finally looked up. At first, there was no recognition, just a flicker of irritation, followed by a slower, curious appraisal. Then Mike reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, oil-darkened object. He placed it on the edge of the desk with quiet precision. A single titanium bolt, custom-threaded, still bearing the faint scratch of the initials SK etched with a pocket knife 17 years ago. Victor stared at it, then at him, and everything changed. The color drained from his face so quickly it looked like someone had flipped a switch inside his skull. You, he whispered. That's not possible. I'm not a ghost, Mike said. Just a mechanic you buried and forgot to finish off. Victor stood, knocking his chair back slightly. Mike Speed, you. God, we thought you were dead, Mike cut in. Yeah, that was the idea. Worked out well for you, didn't it? Victor swallowed hard, trying to regain composure. I, I had nothing to do with what happened that night. You signed my name on the patent transfer 6 months after I vanished. I didn't. I bled into that engine, Mike said. You signed your name over my blood. Victor looked at the bolt like it might explode. Listen, Speed, we can talk about this. I'm sure there's a way to work this out. Mike leaned in, voice low and calm. I'm not here for a deal. I'm here for the truth. And the next time I show up, I won't be alone. So you better start remembering exactly how you built this empire before the whole damn thing comes crashing down. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the bolt behind like a time bomb made of guilt and iron. The next morning, a message arrived. It wasn't from a lawyer, not yet. It wasn't public or formal or even aggressive. Just a short, clipped email with no subject line and one sentence. Come alone. You want the truth, fine, but you better be ready to hear it. The address was a private racetrack on the outskirts of the city, one Mike hadn't seen in years. Back in the day, it had been a proving ground for rookies and engine techs with dreams too big for garages. Now it was owned by Harman Innovations, sealed behind gates and contracts. Mike drove out just before sunset. He pulled into the lot, engine humming low, and found Victor standing at the edge of the track in a pressed jacket and leather gloves, like he was still pretending to be the kind of man who earned his way here. The air smelled of hot rubber and coming rain. I figured you'd come, Victor said. Not looking at him, Mike didn't respond. He waited. Victor turned, arms crossed. You want a confession? Fine. I stole the plans. The words landed like stones dropped into water. Sharp, but unsurprising. You were dead, Victor continued. Or close enough. No body. No statement. No claim. Just fire and silence, I figured. Why waste it? That engine was too good to die with you. Mike's jaw tightened. You didn't even hesitate. Victor smiled faintly. Of course I hesitated. I stared at that prototype for weeks, telling myself I was just holding on to it, that maybe you'd come back. But you didn't. So I took the risk. You forged my signature and paid off a Brooks warehouse manager to look the other way, Victor added. Yeah, I cleaned it up. I made it viable. I filed a new design with minor cosmetic changes. But the guts, the heart that was all you, still is. He stepped forward, eyes glinting now, not with guilt, but pride. And you know what I'd do it again. Mike blinked. You think this world cares about origin stories? Victor went on. It doesn't. It rewards execution. You were brilliant but reckless. You built a masterpiece in a garage with no insurance and no patents. You handed me the keys by disappearing. Mike stepped closer, barely containing the fury rising in his chest. I didn't disappear. I almost died, and you left me there. You left yourself, Victor snapped. You vanished. I just filled the vacuum. Mike stared at him, something breaking inside. Not rage, not yet. Just the sharp realization that Victor hadn't just stolen an engine. He'd stolen belief. He'd taken Mike's vision, his blood-soaked dream, and used it to build something cold, polished, and utterly soulless. And the worst part, he didn't regret it. I made millions, Victor said. I built a name that means something now. And if you think I'm going to hand that over because you decided to crawl out of the ashes after all these years. He let the sentence hang. Mike didn't answer. He didn't need to, because now he wasn't just fighting for a stolen engine. He was fighting for everything that fire had tried but failed to destroy. The late autumn wind whistled through the rafters of the garage as Eleanor set an old wooden box on the workbench with care, like it might fall apart if touched too fast. Mike stood on the other side, wiping grease from his hands, but his attention had already locked on the box. No markings, No hinges, just a sliding top with a rusted groove and weight that felt like history itself. Eleanor didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at it, her fingers hovering over the lid, hesitant. My father kept secrets, she said quietly. Big ones. I spent years thinking I was just being shut out of his work. But it turns out I was being protected. Or maybe shielded. I'm not sure which. Mike tilted his head slightly. What is it? She opened the box. Inside was a single folder, yellowed slightly with time, labeled in neat handwriting, estate draft, private addendum. Eleanor pulled it free, unfolded the document carefully, and handed it across the table. Mike took it like someone being handed a verdict. The paper crackled as he opened it. At the top, a notarized seal, her father's name, William Brooks. Below it, typed in the formal, sterile language of legal documents, a passage that stopped Mike cold. Let it be known that the hybrid energy propulsion prototype referred to in my estate holdings was conceived and co-engineered in partnership with Michael Reynolds, also known as Speed King. He is entitled to 50% of the technology, its derivatives, and future revenue generated thereof, including licensing or sale. Mike blinked. This was dated 2 months before the fire. Eleanor said, he never told me, never filed it publicly. Why? Mike asked, the weight of it catching in his chest. Because Victor found out, she said, and threatened to dissolve their partnership if Dad didn't suppress it. He convinced him you were a risk. An unstable wild card from the street scene, said it would scare off investors. Dad, he believed him. Mike stared at the line again. 50% of the technology. After the fire, Eleanor continued, my father tried to find you, quietly, but the world thought you were dead. And by then, Victor had already begun rewriting history. Mike's voice was low. He buried it. Eleanor nodded. The public will never saw your name. But this second one, it's real. It's signed, witnessed, legal. And if we bring it forward now, Mike looked up, the slow realization burning behind his eyes. It changes everything. Eleanor smiled, sad, proud, resolute. It means you didn't just invent that engine. You own it. For the first time in 17 years, Mike wasn't fighting to prove who he used to be. He was standing in proof that he still was. The sky hung low with heavy clouds as Mike pulled up to the old garage on the outskirts of Silvercrest Ridge, where weeds had grown tall through cracked pavement and vines clawed at rusted siding like time itself was trying to erase the place. He stepped out slowly, leaving the truck running behind him, unsure how long he'd stay. The building sagged with age and memory, collapsed in one corner where the roof had given up years ago. Windows shattered, painted until nothing but bone-gray planks remained. This was where it had all started and ended. The fire hadn't begun in the garage, but this was the last place the prototype had lived. Before the race, before the betrayal, before the name Speed King had been charred off the map. Mike pushed open the warped door with a groan of rusted hinges. Dust swirled in lazy spirals through the shaft of light that broke in from a shattered skylight above. The air smelled of oil, rain, and the ghosts of ambition. He walked slowly, boots crunching over debris, old wrenches, a cracked clock, a faded racing sticker still clinging to the wall like it didn't know time had passed. Every step echoed too loud, bouncing off memories instead of walls. Then he saw it, in the far corner, a scorched metal cabinet, half melted from heat, its hinges fused and twisted. Mike knelt beside it, pried the door open with the edge of a crowbar, and found what the fire hadn't fully consumed. A tattered roll of blueprints, blackened at the edges, some unreadable, others still bearing the fine, confident lines of his younger self's handwriting, schematic notes, flow diagrams, engine layout dimensions marked with calculations he remembered scribbling in grease-stained notebooks. And beneath the roll, a photograph. He paused. It was wrinkled, faded, nearly lost, but still intact. 3 figures stood outside the garage, arms draped around each other. Himself, Victor, and Eleanor. Teenagers. She couldn't have been more than 14, wearing a fireproof jacket too big for her, hair in a ponytail, grease streaked on one cheek, laughing like the world couldn't touch her. Mike's fingers trembled slightly. She had been there that night, all these years. He remembered a girl screaming from the fence line. He'd never been sure if it was real or a trick of the smoke. But now he saw her face again, caught in a single frame of time, and he knew she hadn't just watched it happen. She'd tried to stop it, tried to save him. Mike sat down hard on the cold floor, the photo in his lap, his breath caught somewhere between grief and gratitude. The fire had taken almost everything, but it hadn't taken this. Not the truth, not the proof, not her, outside. The clouds broke just slightly, letting in a sliver of light through the broken roof. Mike struck a match, lit the edges of a ruined schematic, and fed the flame carefully, page by page, burning only the broken drafts, the ones that had carried pain, betrayal, and loss. The blueprints that had been stolen, he kept those. But everything else, the shame, the silence, the past that tried to bury him, he let turn to ash. The sky had shifted to deep amber when Eleanor pulled up beside the garage, dust trailing her tires like a secret that had followed her too long. She didn't ask to come inside. She just stepped out, heels crunching softly against broken concrete, her eyes scanning the ruin like someone revisiting a crime scene that never made the news. Mike stood near the open doorway, soot-stained blueprints rolled under one arm, the old photograph tucked into his jacket pocket like it might shatter if held too tight. He didn't speak as she approached. Didn't need to. She looked at the smoke still curling from a small metal drum where the last pages of his past had been burned. The ash swirled in the air between them, silent and soft. "I remember the smell," she said, voice quiet. "Rubber, gasoline, fear." Mike turned to her slowly. "You were there." She nodded, eyes cast downward. "I always remembered a scream," he said. "Didn't know if it was real. It was me," she whispered. "I was screaming your name while the car burned, and I didn't stop until someone dragged me away." Silence, raw and sharp. "I thought Victor had called you that night," Mike said, searching her face. "He said there was a last-minute run. Told me I couldn't miss it." Eleanor looked up, eyes glassy. "He didn't. I did." Mike's brows drew together. "I brought you to the race," she said. "I told Victor I'd handle it. I said I could convince you to make one last appearance, one last win before the circuit scout signed you. I told myself I was doing it for you. But it wasn't just that." Mike's breath caught in his chest. "I didn't tell you," she went on, "who I really was. That my last name wasn't just Brooks. That my father, William Brooks, owned Brooks Tech. That I wasn't just some gearhead tagging along for thrills. I was the daughter of the man who funded your whole engine. Quietly, through Victor." Mike took a step back, like the ground had shifted beneath him. "You knew," he asked. "All that time?" She nodded slowly. "I knew. My father was watching you, watching what you were building. He believed in your mind, but he didn't believe in your name. He wanted Victor to polish the edges, to get the credit on paper, then bring you in under controlled terms." Mike's jaw tightened. "You brought me there knowing I was never going to leave with my name on anything." "No," she said quickly, stepping closer. "Not at first. Not until that night. I was young, stupid. I thought if I just got you in front of the right people, everything would fall into place. But when I saw that fire, when I saw you inside it, I realized I had handed you over without understanding the cost." Mike stared at her, the old pain igniting behind his eyes. "You let me burn. I never stopped regretting it," she said, voice cracking now. "I tried to find you. I begged my father to release the second will. But after the fire, he said it was too dangerous. For the company, for the family." The wind picked up. The smoke from the ashes danced in the air between them. "I should have told you years ago," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Mike looked at her for a long time. not with anger, but with the hollow ache of someone realizing the betrayal he survived didn't come from strangers. It came from the only person who might have saved him, and didn't. The envelope came in a plain white package with no return address, delivered by courier just after noon. Eleanor had been the one to send the samples. Quietly, carefully, without fanfare. She hadn't pressed him for the decision. She didn't need to. Mike had already said yes the moment he looked into Jason's eyes and saw a younger version of himself. Not in the face, but in the fire. Now he sat alone at his workbench, the envelope unopened. The air in the garage thickened still. The Porsche still sat off to the side, its hood down, the stolen engine now a symbol of 2 stolen lives. But this little slip of paper felt heavier than any machine. He ran his fingers over the flap. He could hear Eleanor's voice in his head, steady and calm. "Whatever it says, it doesn't change the truth you already carry." He opened it anyway. The document was short, 1 page, bold type near the top. Paternal match, 99.97% probability. Mike stared at the number for a long time, eyes unmoving. Body still. He didn't cry, but something deep inside him softened. Something that had been welded shut for 17 years. Jason was his, not just in a way that meant blood, but in the way Mike had already begun to feel it. In the pride that rose every time he saw the kid work an engine with his bare hands or recalibrate a circuit board like he was born with blueprints in his veins. In the way the boy instinctively turned inward when things got hard. Not out of weakness, but because some battles were always fought alone. That was Mike's legacy, and now he saw it had survived him. Eleanor arrived an hour later. She said nothing when he handed her the paper, just looked at it, then at him. Her face was unreadable for a moment, caught somewhere between relief and guilt, and the quiet ache of everything that could never be undone. "I always suspected," she said softly. "The timing, his eyes, the way he never fit inside the life I tried to give him." Mike nodded. "He's brilliant," she added. "Restless, and always asking the right questions. Like someone else I used to know." Mike sat down on the edge of the bench, the paper still in his hand. "He deserves to know," Eleanor said. Mike looked away, out the garage door toward the street where kids were laughing in the distance. "Do you want to tell him?" Eleanor's voice was steady. "I need to." There was no thunder in his chest now, no fear, just clarity, a sense that some pieces of himself had finally stopped spinning. He folded the paper once, slid it into his back pocket, and stood. He wasn't just reclaiming an engine. He was reclaiming a son. It hit like a backhanded storm. No warning. Just a letter dropped at the garage 2 days after the DNA test, delivered by courier with a polite nod and a manila envelope that burned cold in Mike's hands. He didn't have to read past the first line to know it was war. Petition for restriction of contact filed by Patricia Brooks, Jason's legal guardian. Eleanor arrived not long after, her face already pale from the news. She didn't bother with small talk. Just walked straight to Mike's workbench where the letter lay open like an accusation. "She did it," she said, jaw tight. "I knew she would, but I didn't think she'd move this fast." Mike said nothing. He didn't have to. The words on the page spoke louder than anything. That he was unstable. That he had disappeared for nearly 2 decades without explanation. That he'd been involved in illegal street racing and possibly implicated in a fire that claimed lives. That he had no steady income. No permanent residence. That he was, in the eyes of the court, a ghost who should have stayed buried. "She never liked that I was close to my dad's world," Eleanor muttered. "She thought you were reckless even back then. But this isn't about protecting Jason. This is about control. She's afraid of what he might choose if he had the truth." Mike clenched his jaw, voice low. "She's not wrong about one thing. I did disappear. I let the world think I was dead. You were 19, traumatized, betrayed. You did what you had to do to survive." He shook his head slowly. "That's not what a judge will see." Eleanor looked at him, eyes fierce. "Then we show them everything. The will, The engine. The truth about Harmon. We show them you didn't run away from your life. You were pushed out of it. But Mike just stared down at the letter. Because it wasn't just about paperwork. It was about a boy. A boy he had only just started to know. A boy who laughed like him. Who moved like him. Who might already feel the pull of something bigger than he understood. I can't lose him, Mike whispered. You won't. I haven't earned him yet, he added, voice cracking just slightly. Not really. Eleanor stepped closer, placing a hand over his. He's already yours. This fight isn't about earning, it's about protecting. Outside, a car door slammed. Mike turned toward the sound instinctively, heart leaping, but it wasn't Jason, just a stranger passing by. Still, he couldn't stop imagining the day Jason might be standing there and someone telling him, "He doesn't belong to you." Mike looked at the letter again, then slowly, deliberately folded it and slid it into his back pocket beside the DNA results. If Patricia Brooks wanted a fight, he wouldn't run from it. Not this time, because this wasn't about reclaiming a past anymore. It was about claiming a future. The day the sign went up was gray, overcast, with the kind of damp chill that felt like a warning. But for Mike, the weight that had settled in his chest for years finally began to lift. Speed King Engineering? It was simple, direct, and not just a name, it was a reclamation, a resurrection. The sign itself was hand-painted, bright red, the same color as the engines he used to build in the heat of summer, the same fire that had once driven him to be the best. He had nearly forgotten what it felt like to work with that kind of purpose. But standing there in the familiar clutter of tools, grease-streaked floors, and a half-empty parking lot, Mike felt something stir again. It was an old rhythm, but one he remembered well. Eleanor helped. Of course, she always did. It was her idea to bring the community in, to invite the kids who always hung around the corner, peeking in but never stepping inside, the ones with broken bikes and questions about carburetors. She'd pushed him to get the permits, clean up the space, and turn the old garage into a place that wasn't just about fixing cars, it was about building futures. We're not just fixing engines here, she said one morning as they swept the floor together. We're fixing a system. You're going to teach them how to see the parts, how to understand the design, how to make something from nothing. Mike had hesitated at first. He was a mechanic, not a teacher, a racer, not a mentor. But the more he looked at the faces outside his garage window, the kids in their oversized jackets, their hands shoved deep in pockets, the ones who never stayed long enough to make a real change, the more he realized that this wasn't about just fixing engines. It was about fixing them, and maybe fixing himself, too. The first day they opened, there were more kids than he expected, maybe 10. Some came on bikes, some walked in with friends, others were dropped off by parents who didn't say much. They all hovered by the door, unsure of whether they were allowed in, unsure if they really belonged. Mike stood behind the counter, wiping down a rag, eyes scanning them. "I'm Mike," he said simply. "If you need to learn something, I'll teach you. If you're just here to watch, that's fine too." A few of them glanced at each other, uncertain. But one kid, a lanky boy with wild hair and a backward cap, walked straight to the nearest car and started poking around the engine, eyes wide with curiosity. "You know what you're doing?" Mike asked, leaning over the counter, his voice cautious. The boy looked up. "Not really, but I want to learn." Mike nodded, setting down the rag. "Then let's start there. You pull that air filter out, and I'll show you what it does." The others followed, one by one, leaning in with tentative questions. Mike showed them how to disconnect hoses, how to check fluid levels, how to listen to a motor and figure out if it needed more than just a twist of the wrench. And when he watched them, saw the flicker of understanding in their eyes, how they stopped looking at the tools like they were alien, how they started to work with them instead of around them. Something inside him felt right. By the end of the day, the garage was buzzing. Kids were leaning over fenders, holding flashlights, cleaning carburetors. They were asking questions, laughing, And for the first time in a long while, Mike wasn't the one holding everything together. They were all doing it together. And when the last kid left that evening, a bit of oil on his hands, a greasy smile on his face, Mike stood by the door, arms crossed, feeling the weight of something different, something good. "You did good today," Eleanor said, standing beside him, watching the empty lot. Mike didn't look at her, didn't need to. He could feel it, the change in the air, the shift from just surviving to something more. "They're going to learn," he said softly, his voice steady. "Maybe more than they think." She smiled, then slid her arm through his, her warmth steady against the chill. And for the first time in a long time, Mike felt the promise of the future, one built with his own hands, with every lesson passed down. And somehow, it felt like he was finally getting the chance to build something that could last, something worth fighting for, something that could never burn away. The front steps of the Brooks estate were made of smooth stone, framed by perfect hedges and a wrought iron gate that hummed when it opened. But to Jason, the place had never felt like home. It felt like a museum, curated by someone else's expectations. Clean, cold, and full of things you weren't supposed to touch. He stood at the door, backpack slung over one shoulder, his pulse ticking like a metronome in his neck. He wasn't a kid anymore. And today, he didn't plan to ask. He planned to say what had been building in his chest since the day he watched a mechanic in a faded jacket rebuild a busted hybrid engine with nothing but intuition and fire in his eyes. He rang the bell. Inside, the house was silent in the way expensive homes always are, like sound itself had been asked to behave. His mother's voice was the first to break the stillness. "Jason, you're home early." "I'm not here for dinner," he said, stepping into the living room. "Where's Grandma?" Eleanor glanced at him. Her face didn't show surprise, just resignation. She knew. Patricia Brooks entered a moment later, wearing pearls and disapproval like armor. "If this is about the man at the garage," she began, "I've already told the court everything necessary." "It's about me," Jason snapped, his voice firmer than they'd ever heard. "And what I deserve to know." Patricia's expression hardened. "You're a child." "I'm 17, he cut in. "Old enough to know when I've been lied to, and old enough to make my own decisions." Eleanor looked at her son, something shifting in her expression. She didn't try to interrupt. She let him speak. "I met him," Jason said. "Mike. I didn't know who he was at first, but the second I saw the way he worked, the way he moved, I felt it, like I'd seen it before. In myself." Patricia scoffed. "You are nothing like that man." "Yes, I am," Jason said, "and that's not a bad thing." Eleanor finally stepped forward. "Jason," he asked her, softer now, "why didn't you tell me all these years? Why didn't I get to know him?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought I'd ruined everything by letting him go. And I didn't want that mistake to touch you." "It already did," he said quietly. "Every time I wondered who I was. Every time I tried to figure out why I felt like something was missing." He turned to Patricia. "You tried to keep him away from me. You filed court papers to make him disappear again. But I won't let that happen." She opened her mouth, but he didn't give her the chance. "I want to know him," he said, "not because he's perfect, but because he's mine." Silence filled the room like smoke, heavy, charged. Then Jason shouldered his backpack again and stepped back toward the door. "I'm going to see him," he said. "You don't get to decide that anymore." And with that, he left the house, stepping out of the museum and into the life that finally belonged to him. Esserun. The crowd gathered in the shadows of an abandoned viaduct just south of the city, where concrete pillars rose like monuments to things people tried to forget. Smoke curled from food trucks, and muscle cars idled like lions, engines purring low and dangerous. The underground racing scene wasn't what it used to be. More eyes, more risk, more money. But some things never changed. There were still lines drawn in oil and blood. And tonight, one of those lines had Mike Reynolds' name on it. He hadn't raced in over 17 years. Not since the fire. Not since Speed King became a ghost. But tonight wasn't about speed, it was about truth. He stood beside a sleek, low-bodied machine, black matte with red trim, a beast built from scratch in the back of his resurrected garage. Not a sponsor in sight, just him, his hands, and the legacy Harmon tried to steal. Eleanor stood nearby, head set around her neck, hair tied back like she used to when they were just kids in a borrowed pit lane. Jason was there too, leaning against the rail, eyes locked on the car, with a pride he didn't even try to hide. Across the lot. Victor Harmon's driver climbed out of a factory-grade hybrid racer wrapped in corporate logos and carbon fiber. All flash, all money, no soul. Victor stood behind the line, arms folded, smirking like the outcome was already printed. "You sure you can still drive? Speed," he called out. "Last time I checked, ghosts don't win races." Mike didn't flinch. He just stepped into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut, and placed both hands on the wheel. The cockpit was silent, just him and the sound of his own breath. But in his chest, something burned. This wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. A voice crackled through his headset. "Eleanor's, track set, 2 laps, no shortcuts, no cameras, just you and the truth." Mike smiled faintly. "Copy that." The flag dropped. Rubber screamed against concrete, and the cars launched like rockets into the dark. The Harmon racer took the lead early, sleek and overpowered. It barreled into the first corner like it had something to prove. But Mike knew these streets, knew the weight of every turn, the grip of the tires, the way momentum could betray you if you didn't feel it. Halfway through lap 1, he closed the gap. By the start of lap 2, he was breathing down the other driver's tailpipe. Then came the switchback, tight, narrow, and brutal. It had taken lives before. It had almost taken his, but not tonight. Mike downshifted, heel-toe brake, and let the car dance sideways. Engine snarling like a beast set free, he slid inside the curve. Engine whistling with the voice he gave it. And when he came out on the other side, he was in front. The crowd erupted. Harmon's driver pushed hard, but it didn't matter. The machine under Mike wasn't just a car. It was a memory rebuilt in steel and fire. When he crossed the finish line, silence fell for a split second. Then a roar broke through the dark. Mike stepped out, helmet in hand, sweat lining his brow. Victor looked stunned, hollow. Mike didn't gloat, didn't smile. He just walked past him, paused for a breath, and said, "That engine, that win, that legacy, it was never yours to carry." And for the first time in 17 years, Speed King wasn't a myth. He was a man who came back not to race, but to reclaim. The engine growled beneath him, the finish line just 50 yards ahead, painted in thick white strokes across cracked concrete, flanked by roaring lights and a sea of shouting bodies. Mike was ahead, clean, no draft to worry about, no sudden pressure from behind, just the open stretch of pavement and the victory that had eluded him for half his life. But as he neared the line, something shifted. It wasn't the tires or the steering. It was him, the younger version of himself, the one who'd lived for checkered flags, fist pumps, and midnight glory would have slammed through that line with tires screaming, heart pounding, arms raised in a defiant triumph. But the man gripping the wheel now didn't want a photo finish. He wanted peace. So Mike lifted his foot from the accelerator. The car slowed, easing off the final stretch like a whisper. The crowd, once a wild storm of noise, faltered into stunned silence. And then he did something no one expected. He pulled over just feet from the line and cut the engine. Eleanor's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Mike, what are you doing?" "You've got it. Take it." But Mike sat still, both hands on the wheel, eyes staring ahead into the floodlights. "I already took it," he said quietly. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The other car tore past seconds later, crossing the line in confusion. Not celebration. A few cheers erupted, half-hearted and scattered. But the energy had already shifted. Everyone had seen what mattered. The race hadn't been won in distance. It had been claimed in intention. Jason stood at the edge of the track, stunned, heart thumping in his chest. He'd watched every second, every turn, seen the flawless control in his father's movements, the quiet dominance that didn't need noise, but it was the ending that taught him the most. Mike walked toward him, helmet under his arm, sweat drying on his brow. He didn't look like someone who'd lost. He looked like someone who had let go. "Why'd you stop?" Jason asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mike looked him in the eyes. "Because proving you can win," he said, "isn't the same as needing to." Jason absorbed the words. They didn't hit all at once. They took root deep. "You walked away," Mike nodded. "I walked away with everything that matters. My name, my truth, and you," across the lot. Victor Harmon watched, jaw tight, face unreadable. He'd won the race by default, but it didn't feel like victory. Not in the way the crowd turned, not in the silence that followed Mike like gravity. Jason stepped beside his father. "That was the best thing I've ever seen," Mike smiled faintly. "It wasn't about the finish line. It was about showing them I never needed it." And with that, the two walked away, past the crowd, past the trophies, past the cameras, waiting for a dramatic quote that never came. Legacy wasn't about being first. It was about knowing when to stop running. It started with a headline, small at first, buried in the tech business section. "Harmon Tech under review after whistleblower leak." No names, no fury, just a quiet tremor in the corner of the empire Victor had built. But tremors don't stay small for long, not when truth is buried beneath marble and money. Within 48 hours, it was everywhere. A leaked internal memo, a disgruntled ex-engineer, a second will, verified, notarized, and now public. Bearing Michael Reynolds' name as co-creator of the hybrid engine Harmon had paraded as his crown jewel. Investors didn't ask for context. They didn't wait for press conferences. They did what wolves do when they smell weakness. They pulled out, one by one. Share prices dropped like bolts in a windstorm. Offices closed their doors. Contracts were frozen, and just like that, the illusion began to crack. Mike stood outside the courthouse the morning the ruling came down. The sun low behind him, casting a quiet halo of light over the steps. He didn't dress like a victor. No tie, no speech, just boots, a clean black shirt, and the same hands that once built dreams in a half-lit garage. Eleanor stood beside him, eyes locked on her phone as the judgment was released. "Patent 8843J, she read aloud, voice steady. "Original design and intellectual property for the hybrid combustion electric engine awarded to Michael Reynolds and William Brooks. Co-contributors, co-holders." Mike exhaled slowly, not smiling, not celebrating, just breathing. "It's done," she said. "It's done." But it didn't feel like triumph. Not in the cinematic way people imagined. It felt like a weight being set down after carrying it for half a lifetime. Victor Harmon didn't appear in court that day, but the media caught up with him hours later, storming out of a boardroom, tie loosened, sweat beating at his temple. No PR spin, no grin. Just a man watching everything he built collapse under the truth he buried. When asked to comment, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. His name was stripped from the engine's patent retroactively. Every award, every royalty, every page in the trade magazines that had once praised his vision and innovation, all now haunted by an asterisk. Mike's name was returned to its rightful place, not for fame, for justice. Back at the garage that evening, neighborhood kids gathered around the radio, listening as a reporter told the story of how a mechanic from nowhere had just taken down a multi-million-dollar fraud. They didn't know the full story, but they knew the ending. Mr. Speed had built that engine. Jason stood beside his father, holding a copy of the reinstated patent. It was official now, signed, sealed, and framed, ready to hang over the workbench where Mike still fixed busted engines, like nothing had changed. "Feels weird," Jason said. Seeing your name on something everyone will read. Mike looked at him, then at the paper in his hands. Doesn't feel like mine, he said quietly. Feels like it belongs to the kid who never stopped believing in me, even before he knew who I was. Jason smiled. That kid's still learning. Mike placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost chasing down what he'd lost. He felt like a man finally seen not by the world, but by the one person who mattered most. The garage smelled like oil, steel, and fresh beginnings. Sunlight streamed through the high window panes, catching on flecks of dust and old ambition. The doors were wide open, letting the breeze in, carrying the sound of laughter from kids playing down the block. Inside, two figures stood side by side at the workbench, one with calloused hands and history etched into his shoulders, the other young, hungry, and quietly proud. Jason leaned over the open hood of a vintage roadster, brows furrowed. So this thing actually ran? Mike smirked, wiping his hands on a rag. Not just ran, she flew. 78 Z-line, turbocharged six-cylinder. She wasn't pretty, but she moved like sin on Sunday. Jason snorted. You name all your cars. Only the ones that broke my heart. The boy laughed, really laughed, and Mike felt it deep in his ribs, like someone had turned on the lights inside him. They hadn't had this before. They hadn't had baseball games or bedtime stories or math homework battles at the kitchen table, but they had this. Grease on their hands, grit under their nails, the shared language of torque and timing and tiny miracles buried under metal. They worked in sync. Jason followed instructions without flinching, handed tools with instinct, asked questions that made Mike pause, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. Ever think about racing again? Jason asked, his voice casual, eyes on the engine. Mike tightened a bolt and looked up. No, I raced when I was running from something. Now I'm building things I want to last. Jason nodded, taking that in. I get that. For a while they didn't speak. Just the sound of tools clicking, engine parts clinking, the occasional hum of a passing car on the street. Then quietly, Jason said, Did you ever wonder about me? Mike set the wrench down and turned toward him, wiping his palms. Every day, he said. Even when I thought I didn't deserve to. Jason didn't look up right away. I used to imagine what kind of person my dad was. Sometimes I thought maybe he was dead. Other times I hoped he was just waiting for the right time. Mike swallowed the lump in his throat. I wasn't waiting. I was hiding. And I wish I hadn't. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. The boy looked at him then, and something in his face so much like Mike's and yet entirely his own softened. I'm glad it's you, he said simply. Mike reached out and gripped his shoulder, firm but gentle. No grand speeches, no dramatic apologies, just presence, just two hands rebuilding something that had never truly been finished. That night, they stayed late, the garage glowing with the soft hum of overhead lights. They ate pizza off a dusty hood, drank sodas from a cooler Mike kept in the corner, and watched old races on an ancient laptop. Speed King and grainy footage, taking curves with reckless precision. That really you? Jason asked, pointing. Mike chuckled. Now I'm just a guy trying to be a good father. Jason leaned back against the car, hands behind his head. You're off to a good start. Outside, the moon rose quiet and slow, and in the garage where a legacy had once burned, something brighter had begun to glow, slowly, steadily, like the heat of a fire, rebuilt not to destroy, but to warm. It was late afternoon when Eleanor returned to the garage, sunlight catching in her hair as she stepped through the wide doors like it was the first time all over again. The place was humming quietly, tools clinking, radio humming an old soul tune, and Mike underneath the hood of a half-restored El Camino, whistling low. He didn't see her at first, or maybe he did and just wanted her to see the life she'd helped resurrect without making it a show. She waited until he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, sweat on his brow and grease on his cheek like a badge of honor. They didn't say much at first, just that quiet smile between two people who'd survived something most wouldn't understand. Then she held out a small envelope. "Before I change my mind," she said. Voice light but trembling just enough that Mike caught it. He raised an eyebrow and took it. "What's this, a signature?" she said. "On a deed, the one my father had locked away for years." Mike blinked, opened the envelope, and pulled out the paperwork. Legal, stamped, official. At the bottom, her name freshly signed in blue ink. "You're giving me the garage," he said, half in awe, half in disbelief. "I'm giving it back," she corrected, eyes steady. "This was always yours. I just kept the lights on." He looked at her, holding the papers like they might disintegrate if he breathed too hard. "Why now?" She gave a small shrug. "Because you finally believe in it again. And in yourself." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, but reverent. Like a final puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Eleanor stepped further in, letting her fingers trail over the smooth edge of the workbench. "When I was a teenager, I used to sit right over there," she said, nodding toward a crooked stool by the shelves. "Watch you build things I didn't understand. And I remember thinking, whatever you had in your hands always turned into something that moved. Not just engines, ideas, people, me." Mike's voice was quiet. "You built this with me, whether you admit it or not." She smiled. "I never wanted the name on the wall. I just wanted to make sure it still stood." He took a breath, deep and steady, eyes drifting toward the wall above the bay door. Speed King Engineering, red paint, clean lines. But the truth was, without her, the name would still be buried under ash. Eleanor reached into her coat and pulled out a set of keys. Not to the cars, to the office. The one she used. The one she ran everything from. "These two," she said, pressing them into his hand. "Time I let go." He stared down at them, then at her. "Stay anyway." She paused, smiled. "I think I will." And with that, the last piece of the past she'd been carrying fell away. Not with drama, not with tears, but with a simple gesture of trust. Later that night, Mike hung a new frame beside the patent on the garage wall. Inside it, the signed deed. Eleanor's handwritten note clipped to the bottom. "You kept the fire. I just held the matches. E." And the lights never went out again. The morning the plaque went up, the sky was the kind of blue you could fall into. No clouds, no noise. Just light stretching over the neighborhood like something sacred. The garage had been busy since dawn. Kids from the block drifted in and out, some pretending to help. Most just there to watch Mike work like they were studying a legend in real time. He didn't mind. He welcomed it. Because today wasn't just another work day. It was a reckoning. The plaque arrived wrapped in velvet, carried under Eleanor's arm like it was holding something breakable. Jason followed her, toolbox in hand, eyes wide with anticipation and pride. Mike stood outside, wiping the sweat off his brow, the front of his shirt stained with oil and sunlight. He'd known it was coming, had helped design it, but now that it was real, now that the moment had arrived. His hands trembled more than he wanted to admit. Eleanor climbed the stepladder first. Jason passed up the screws. Mike held the plaque steady beneath her, the way a man might hold a piece of his soul being placed back where it always belonged. When she fastened the last screw and stepped down, no one spoke for a long time. The plaque gleamed in the morning light, polished black metal, embossed lettering. Speed King Engineering built from ashes, tuned by fire. Mike stared up at it, his breath caught somewhere in his chest, not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. That a name he'd buried had not just survived, it had risen behind him. The kids clapped. Eleanor smiled through glassy eyes. Even Jason looked stunned, like he was finally seeing his father's past and future folded into the same moment. Mike turned to face them all. "Speed King wasn't just a name I used when I wanted to disappear," he said, voice steady but low. It was who I was before I thought the world could take something away from me and leave me hollow. He paused, glancing up again. But I was wrong. You can lose everything, your future, your friends, even your name, and still come back, still build, not in spite of the fire, because of it. Eleanor stepped beside him, her hand brushing his. Jason moved forward next, pulling something from his pocket. It was a small gear, old, weathered, with scorch marks around the edge. Found this in the bin outside the old track, he said. Figured it was yours. Mike took it gently, turning it in his hand. It is, he murmured. He walked over to the workbench and placed it in a shadow box right next to the reinstated patent and Eleanor's signed deed. 3 pieces of a life that refused to stay broken. Outside, the sound of tools started up again. Someone revved an engine down the block. The neighborhood returned to its rhythm. But inside that garage, beneath that plaque, a man once lost to the world now stood whole again. And this time, everyone knew his name. The track was quiet in the early morning light, the kind of stillness that made even the air feel reverent. Dew clung to the faded banners, ghosts of sponsors long gone, and the old bleachers stood like weary sentinels watching over stories they couldn't tell. But at the far end of the pit lane, something new gleamed in the sun. A car that didn't just hum with power, but with purpose. It was Jason's design, his first concept. A hybrid electric racer unlike anything Mike had ever seen. The body was low and wide, sleek but muscular. The paint was a deep graphite gray, broken only by a crimson stripe that ran from the hood to the rear, a quiet nod to the fire that built them both. Mike ran his fingers across the hood. She's beautiful, he said, awe in every syllable. Jason stood beside him, proud but nervous, hands in the pockets of his coveralls. Built her from the ground up, he said. Took everything you taught me and some things I learned on my own. Mike grinned. Good. The world doesn't need another me. It needs the first you. They loaded the final diagnostics into the onboard computer, adjusted the rear suspension one last time, and rolled the car to the start line. The track was the same one where Speed King had once burned rubber into the history books. The same place where the fire had nearly ended everything, and now it would be the place where everything began again. Jason climbed into the driver's seat, hands settling on the wheel with the ease of someone born for it. Mike stood beside the car, headset on, just like Eleanor used to when they were kids chasing impossible dreams. You ready, son? He asked. Jason looked up, grinning. I was born ready. The engine hummed to life, not a roar, but a controlled surge. Precision over fury, grace over speed. The car didn't sound angry. It sounded hungry. Mike stepped back and raised a hand. Go! Tires kissed the pavement, and the concept car launched forward like a whisper wrapped in lightning. It curved through the track like it had always belonged there, taking corners with confidence, gliding down straights with effortless grace. No showboating, no reckless speed, just control. Mike watched from the pit wall, chest rising with every breath, a quiet tremble in his throat. This wasn't just a test run. This was a statement. Jason wasn't trying to outrun the past. He was driving right through it and out the other side. When the car slid to a perfect stop in front of the garage, Jason stepped out, breathless and beaming. She held, he said, smooth, sharp, like she knows what she wants to be. Mike walked over and rested a hand on the hood, feeling the warmth still radiating from within. She's a machine with soul, he said, just like her builder. They stood there together, father and son, overlooking the track not as a place where something was lost, but where something far greater was found. Legacy wasn't about what you left behind. It was what you passed forward. And that day, on the very pavement where Speed King had vanished, a new name took the wheel, and this time, the fire built the future. The day of the hearing arrived with the kind of stillness reserved for moments that change everything. Mike stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie he hadn't worn in years. his fingers less sure with silk than they were with socket wrenches. Eleanor had helped pick out the suit, navy blue, conservative, a far cry from the oil-stained coveralls that had become his second skin. But today wasn't about comfort. It was about appearance. About convincing a judge that the man who disappeared 17 years ago deserved to be in his son's life. Jason had insisted on coming, despite both Mike and Eleanor's concerns. "It's my life," he'd said. "I should get a say." So now he waited downstairs in a pressed shirt and slacks that made him look older than his years. Thumbing through a car magazine with forced nonchalance, Patricia Brooks had filed a formal petition for full guardianship and restricted visitation, painting Mike as an unstable influence with a dangerous past. The paperwork was meticulous, each allegation carefully worded to emphasize risk and minimize redemption. The courtroom was smaller than Mike expected, wood-paneled and serious, with the kind of quiet that felt like judgment before a word was spoken. Patricia sat on one side, her attorney a polished man with silver at his temples and confidence in his posture. Eleanor and Mike sat opposite, Jason between them like a bridge connecting worlds that were never meant to meet. The judge, a woman with shrewd eyes and decades of family court written into the lines of her face, reviewed the file silently before looking up. "This is an unusual case," she said, her voice carrying that perfect balance of authority and neutrality. "We have a father who, by his own admission, has been absent for the entirety of his son's life. We have a grandmother seeking to formalize an arrangement that has been in place since birth. And we have a young man approaching adulthood who seems to have strong opinions of his own." She looked directly at Jason. "Young man, before we proceed with arguments, I'd like to hear from you. Why do you believe contact with your father is in your best interest?" Jason straightened, swallowed once, and spoke with a clarity that surprised even Eleanor. "Your Honor, my whole life I've felt like I was missing a part of myself, like I was building something without the right blueprints. My mother kept my father's identity from me because she thought she was protecting me. My grandmother wants to keep him away because she's afraid of what might change. But I'm not afraid." He glanced at Mike, then back to the judge. "2 months ago, I met a mechanic who showed me how to modify an engine for better torque distribution. I didn't know he was my father. I just knew that, for the first time. Someone understood how I think, how I see the world. He didn't disappear because he didn't want me. He disappeared because someone tried to destroy him." Patricia's attorney started to object, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Your Honor," Jason continued, "I'm asking for the chance to know my father, not because the law says I should, but because there's something in me that already does." The courtroom fell silent. Even Patricia looked affected, though she tried to hide it behind a practiced mask of concern. The evidence unfolded over the next hour. Eleanor submitted the reinstated patent, proving Mike's intellectual contribution to an industry-changing design. 3 of the teenagers from the neighborhood workshop testified about his mentorship. And finally, Mike himself stood before the court, not as Speed King, but as a father asking for a second chance at a first beginning. "I spent 17 years believing the world was better off thinking I was dead," he said. "I was wrong. Not just about the world, but about myself. I can't get those years back, but I can make sure the ones ahead count." The judge considered everything, her pen tapping softly against the legal pad before her. Then she spoke. "Mr. Reynolds, your past is troubling. Your disappearance, regardless of the circumstances, left a void in your son's life that cannot be measured. However, your recent actions show a commitment to stability and positive influence that this court cannot ignore." She turned to Patricia. "Mrs. Brooks, your concern for your grandson is commendable, but he is of an age where his wishes carry significant weight, and it is clear to this court that he wishes to know his father. The ruling, when it came, was measured, joint custody, structured visitation that would increase over time, mandatory counseling for all parties, and a stern warning that any disruption to Jason's academic or emotional well-being would result in immediate review." But as they left the courtroom, the legal language faded into the background. What remained was simpler. A boy walking beside his father, shoulders relaxed for the first time in years, a mother watching them with complicated pride, and a future that no longer had to navigate around the ghosts of the past. Outside, the sun had broken through clouds that had threatened all morning, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Mike looked up, squinting into the light. "What now?" Jason asked. Mike smiled, a real smile, the kind that started in his eyes and worked its way down. "Now," he said, "we build something that lasts." The symposium hall buzzed with the particular energy that comes from gathering the best minds in an industry under one roof. Engineers, designers, innovators, all drawn to the annual Alternative Energy Expo, where the next generation of power systems would be unveiled. Among the polished corporate displays and slick presentations stood a modest booth with a hand-painted sign, "Speed King Engineering." No fancy backdrops, no professional models in tight dresses pointing at shiny components. Just a stripped-down engine on a rotating platform, its elegant design speaking for itself. Mike stood slightly off to the side, arms folded, watching as a crowd gathered around Jason, who was deep into an explanation of the dual-phase cooling system they'd developed. The boy no. The young man moved his hands with the same precision he used when working on actual engines. His eyes lit with the particular fire that comes from sharing a passion. "The traditional approach wastes energy during the conversion," Jason was saying, "but our system captures that heat, redirects it through these channels, and feeds it back into the propulsion cycle. 15% efficiency gain without additional input." A representative from Pacific Motors leaned in, adjusting his glasses. "And the torque ratio at low speeds nearly doubles," Jason said without hesitation. "We can demonstrate if you like." Eleanor appeared at Mike's side, coffee in hand, her professional attire a stark contrast to the casual clothes she wore at the garage. "He's a natural," she said softly. Mike nodded. "Gets that from his mother," she snorted. "Right. That's why I spent my teenage years hiding in the bleachers while you worked miracles with junkyard parts." "You weren't hiding," he said. "You were learning." The crowd had thinned slightly, and Jason was now engaged in animated conversation with a gray-haired engineer whose badge indicated he was from one of the leading research universities on the coast. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she meant more than just the expo. Mike considered the question, watching his son's hands trace the air as he explained a concept. "No," he said honestly. "For a long time, I thought the best parts of my life had already burned away. I was just surviving. But now you're building again," she finished. "We all are." The afternoon session was winding down when a familiar face appeared at the edge of the booth. Victor Harmon. Older now, less polished than the last time Mike had seen him. The scandal had taken its toll, professionally and personally. His company had survived, but in a diminished form, and the industry whispers suggested he was barely holding on to control. He hesitated, then approached, hands in his pockets. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Impressive design," he said, nodding toward the engine. "Your boy's got talent." Mike tensed slightly but kept his voice even. "What do you want?" "Victor." Victor glanced around, then sighed. "To say I'm sorry, for what it's worth, which probably isn't much." Mike studied him, looking for the angle, the hidden play, but all he saw was a man worn down by the consequences of his own choices. "Why now?" Mike asked. "Because I'm selling what's left of the company," Victor said. "Moving to Florida, starting over, and I didn't want to leave with this still hanging between us." He extended his hand, not demanding, just offering. Mike looked at it for a long moment. 17 years ago, he would have turned away. Even 2 years ago, he might have. But now, with his son's voice in the background explaining the future they were building together, the past didn't seem to weigh as much. He took Victor's hand, brief, firm, not forgiveness, exactly, but closure. Victor nodded once, understanding what wasn't said, then turned to leave. He paused, looking back. You won after all. Speed. Mike shook his head. It was never about winning. It was about building something true. Later, as they packed up the display, Jason asked about the exchange. Mike told him the truth about grudges that burn from the inside out, about the difference between justice and vengeance, and about the freedom that comes from letting go. So you forgave him? Jason asked, carefully wrapping a component in protective foam. I let him go, Mike corrected. There's a difference. That night, back at the garage, they celebrated their first major contract, not with champagne or fancy restaurants, but with pizza on the hood of a car, and the neighborhood kids crowded around to hear Jason explain how he'd convinced Pacific Motors to take a chance on an independent shop with more heart than history. Eleanor leaned against Mike's shoulder, watching their son hold court. I always knew he'd be special, she said quietly. He had you. Mike replied, how could he be anything else? She smiled, turning slightly to face him. He has us both now, and something tells me that's exactly what he needed. The garage was alive with laughter and possibility. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, mapping constellations of past and future across the sky. And in that moment, surrounded by the family he'd found and the legacy he'd reclaimed, Mike knew with absolute certainty that some fires don't destroy, they transform. 5 years passed like a high-performance engine, smooth, powerful, and faster than anyone expected. Speed King Engineering grew from a neighborhood garage to a respected name in alternative energy systems, with contracts spanning 3 states and a waiting list for their custom builds. The original space expanded, taking over the abandoned lot next door, adding a proper classroom where Mike and Jason taught evening courses to everyone from gifted teenagers to retirees looking to understand the vehicles of the future. The plaque still hung above the main entrance, its message unchanged, but the meaning had deepened with each passing season. On a warm Saturday in June, the garage hosted an open house, not a formal affair. Speed King wasn't built for formality, but a community celebration marking half a decade of rebuilding what fire had nearly taken away. The lot overflowed with people, former street racers, now legitimate drivers with sponsors and safety gear. Neighbors who'd watched skeptically as the old garage transformed into something new. Engineers who'd once worked for Harman and now collaborated with the Reynolds team on next-generation power systems. At the center of it all, gleaming in the sunlight, stood the Phoenix, the hybrid racer Jason had designed, now evolved into a sleek machine that had won its class at 3 professional events. Beside it, under a protective cover, waited something new, something not yet revealed. Mike moved through the crowd, older now but with the same steady hands and clear eyes, accepting congratulations with the quiet grace of a man who measured success not in accolades, but in the sturdiness of what he built. Eleanor ran the business side of things, her financial acumen turning passion into sustainable profit.